Hello, this is the ethics video in research methods. If I can just remind you as you listen to this video to write the Cornell notes as best you can and also answer the questions that I'll ask as we go through the video. Once you've finished, write this up as neatly as you can into your mind map and have a little look through some of the additional textbooks. Okay, let's have a little look at some ethical issues. We do have a list, a code that psychologists work against, and this is made by the British Psychological Society, or the BPS. So they've written out a list of ethical guidelines, and these are made to protect the rights of participants and really the safety of participants and the researcher as well. Okay, let's have a little look through some of these before discussing how maybe we could get around them a little bit. Number one is informed consent. So informed consent is the principle that the participants must be told the true purpose of the research before agreeing to take part. Now, if you listen to these in order, we might have just had the demand characteristics video where we say, well, if participants know the research aims, then they're going to adapt their behaviour, making the research effectively useless. So this informed consent is quite a difficult ethical principle for us about saying that, well, people really need to know what's going on before they take part. Next one, kind of similar, is deception. So deception is the idea that people may be told that the research is about something else, or not told everything that's going to happen in the study. And obviously this is going to need to be kept to a minimum as much as possible. Okay, protection from harm. So this means that when participants agree to take part in your study, you should never really ask them to do an activity or put themselves in a position where they're going to have more psychological risk of harm or more physiological risk of harm than they would just in their day-to-day life. So you can't just start feeding electricity through them anymore, all that kind of stuff. The right to withdraw. So the right to withdraw is that at any point during the experiment they can say, wait, actually I'm not happy with this, I want the research to end, and they can just stand up and go, and that's fine. And that needs to be made clear to them before they start that they can do that. But even after they finish the study and they've walked out, they can withdraw the data after that point. Obviously, there is kind of an implicit timeline on this. Once the research has been published, it's far too late to do that. But for a short time after the study, they can withdraw their data. Okay. Confidentiality. This is a little bit different than the privacy one below. Sometimes they get a little bit confused. So confidentiality is the idea that people can tell you information, but we're not going to make it clear who said what in, say, an interview situation. So they're not going to suddenly pick up a research article and see their name and they said this. So this is an idea to avoid embarrassment. And privacy. This is simply the idea that we shouldn't go and do, say, observations on people in situations where they wouldn't expect it. Like, you can't say, oh, what do people do at 8 p.m. at night in their own homes, and start peeking through windows. That's pretty much frowned upon because people should have the right to have privacy in their own homes. What you might do is you might find that you can do observations of people in public places. Okay, so these are all ethical issues. These are all things that we need to consider. And quite often, as I said before, we can't really gain consent or some of the others because of the risk of demand characteristics. So we have to try and think of ways to get other forms of consent. And we're going to run through some solutions now. Okay. So one option would be something called prior general consent. So this would be participants would come in, and rather than giving them a very particular consent form which outlines exactly what they'll be doing in this study, you give them a larger consent form which has a range of things that you could test them on, and within that list there's what actually they will be tested on, and then they sign the entire consent form. It is maybe a little sneaky, but What it means is they have at least read what they'll be tested on, but they won't be, they won't necessarily figure out, based on that sign, that consent form, exactly what your research is about before they've even started it. Presumptive consent. So what you do for this is, let's say you were wanting to do some research on a class, for example, you might go and ask a similar class with similar demographics, similar age groups, if they would agree to the conditions. So you'd explain the study in full to them and say, and this is what I'd like to do, would you agree to take part in this research? And if they say yes, that's great, then you continue with this other group. Now, technically, that means that the group you did do the research on didn't give consent. None of these are perfect solutions, but I mean, at least it is a way of checking with similar people if the research would be acceptable. Okay, another slightly sneaky way is retrospective consent. So you do the study with a person, perhaps without them realizing it, and then afterwards you say, you've just taken part in the study, is it okay if I use your data in the research? If they say no, then you remove the data. If they say yeah, then you keep it. Again, a little bit on sketchy ground, because they've actually taken part in the research, especially if there's some element of the research that was somewhat uncomfortable, this could be a problem. So those were 3 different types of ways of gaining consent that isn't necessarily telling the participant exactly what's coming up in the experiment. Okay, so it's fairly clear that we probably will have to breach some of these ethical guidelines at some point. But in order to do this, we need to really think carefully about why we're breaching the guidelines. Is it really worth doing the research in order to gain this data? So what we do is we do a cost-benefit analysis. We think about the potential costs of the participants. Is there any psychological harm? Is there any physiological harm? Is it just, time out their lives that they didn't need to be spending? What potential costs are there to participants taking part in this? And then we might balance this out to, well, okay, what could it mean if we actually gain some interesting results here? Could it benefit society? Could it just add to scientific knowledge more generally? And then we try and work out, is the cost too high for the benefit we might get, or is the benefit so good that the cost is quite low? You might not end up making that decision as a researcher, because obviously as a researcher you're pretty biased. You really want to conduct your research, and you might minimize the idea about how much harm might come to the participants. So ideally, and if you go on to university to do a psychology degree, you certainly, when you do your third year project, your project before you get to collect your data will go to something called an ethics committee. There's a small group of people, and they will look at your research and make this cost-benefit analysis, and they'll decide whether your research should go ahead or not, and then you'll be informed of it. Okay, before I move on, a quick question for you to prepare before you come into class. I'd like you to think of Zimbardo's prison study. I'd like you to list how he might have breached ethical guidelines. These ethical guidelines weren't in place when he did his research, but if he was doing it today. And I'd also like you to very quickly write down a cost-benefit analysis. I'd like you to write down some of the harms that came to the participants, but I'd also like you to think about the benefits to society from Zimbardo's research. And then I'd like you to make a decision about whether Zimbardo's research should have gone ahead. And I'll ask all of you when you come into class. Okay, so 2 more quick things to think about when you're prepping your research, and about how we would communicate with the participants what they'll be experiencing from an ethical point of view. So before we start a study, and we've got our participants, before we start collecting the data, we do need to ask if they'd be willing to take part, and this is the role of the briefing. So we give them a little bit of information just to kind of get them on board, maybe not enough that we would risk demand characteristics. So, if you're going to use up mild electric shocks or pain in any way, of course this is going to have to come in during the briefing. The debriefing is after they've taken part and you've gathered the data. Now, at this stage, you can tell them everything about your study because it isn't going to affect the data that you've just collected. So it's kind of like a little interview that you do with them to talk about their experience on the research. You tell them the aims of the study in ways that they can understand. You might give them a bunch of details that you haven't given them in the study. One key thing is the existence of other groups. If they've taken part in condition A and it was a dependent groups design and someone took part in condition B, you tell them about condition B. You tell them what the data is going to be used for. You say that they can withdraw the data. This might be the time to get that retrospective consent. Or if in some way the study might have been stressful or caused significant embarrassment, you might offer counselling as part of your duty for protection of harm. And then you remind them that their information will be kept confidential and that any contributions they made would be anonymous. Okay, that's it.